The first sign was not fire or smoke, but silence. Enemy pilots flying familiar attack routes felt their engines hesitate in mid-air, as if something unseen had briefly reached inside the machinery. Propellers lost rhythm. Power dipped without warning. At the same moment, a sharp, unnatural tone cut through their headsets, a thin radio whistle that did not belong to any known signal or command. There was no flak in the sky, no fighters on the horizon, yet formations began to loosen as pilots instinctively pulled away, unsure whether they were facing sabotage, mechanical failure, or something entirely new. Reports from different squadrons soon echoed the same details. The effect was short-lived, often lasting only seconds, but it was enough to break timing and force aborted runs. Engines usually recovered on their own, leaving crews shaken rather than shot down. Back on the ground, mechanics searched for damage and found nothing conclusive. Cylinders were intact, fuel lines were clean. The aircraft appeared healthy, as if the disturbance had never happened. What unsettled commanders was the pattern. These incidents clustered in specific stretches of sky and coincided with intense radio interference. Monitoring stations picked up a peculiar whistling tone riding on powerful transmissions, strong enough to overwhelm normal communications. No one had designed it, no one had planned it, yet for a brief moment it seemed that radio energy alone might be capable of unsettling aircraft in flight. This was not a weapon that destroyed machines, but one that disturbed them, unreliable, inconsistent, and poorly understood. And it raised a troubling question that engineers could not ignore. Had modern air warfare accidentally revealed a vulnerability that existed beyond guns and armor, hidden in the invisible space between transmitter and engine? Keep watching to see how wartime engineers tried to make sense of this phenomenon, and why it hovered on the edge between accident and weapon without ever fully crossing that line. By the early years of the air war, aircraft had become flying networks of wires, coils, and compromises. Radios were no longer optional. Crews depended on them for navigation, formation flying, interception warnings, and emergency coordination. Yet these systems had been added quickly, often layered onto airframes that were never designed with electromagnetic shielding in mind. Long cable runs snaked through fuselages, antennas were exposed, electrical noise was accepted as an inconvenience rather than a danger. At the same time, the ground below was changing just as rapidly. Air defense networks relied on powerful radio transmitters to guide fighters, coordinate radar stations, and flood the airwaves with command traffic. These signals grew stronger as the war intensified. Engineers pushed transmission power higher to cut through interference and reach aircraft farther from base. The invisible space between ground and sky became saturated with energy. Few fully understood how this energy behaved. Electromagnetic theory existed, but its practical effects on complex machines were still being discovered through trial and error. When radios shrieked or instruments twitched, crews learned to live with it. Engines, however, were assumed to be immune. They were mechanical beasts, driven by fuel, compression, and spark. The idea that radio waves could influence them seemed unlikely, almost absurd. Electronic warfare was only just beginning to take shape. Radar jamming, false signals, and navigation deception were being explored, but always with a clear purpose and defined systems. What no one expected was that ordinary transmissions, never intended as weapons, might interact unpredictably with aircraft systems in flight. The battlefield had expanded into a domain that commanders could sense but not yet control, where cause and effect were blurred by physics no one had time to fully master. The first serious attention came not from pilots, but from radio rooms. Signal officers comparing logs noticed that reports of engine hesitation clustered around moments of extreme radioactivity. These were not routine transmissions, but periods when multiple high-power stations were operating at once, flooding the spectrum to coordinate interceptions or maintain contact with aircraft, pushing the limits of range. On paper, the overlap looked accidental. In practice, it appeared too frequently to ignore. Engineers were brought in quietly. They began matching flight reports with transmission schedules, frequency bands, and signal strength. Patterns emerged, though never cleanly. Some aircraft were affected while others were not. Certain engine types appeared more vulnerable, particularly those with older wiring layouts and minimal shielding. Altitude, weather conditions, and maintenance quality all seemed to influence the outcome. Nothing about the data suggested predictability. Attempts to reproduce the effect under controlled conditions failed. Engines ran normally when isolated. Radios produced interference, but the distinctive mid-air hesitation refused to appear on command. Only when aircraft systems were considered together, engine, wiring, radio, and environment, did the anomaly seem possible, and even then only briefly. It could not be engineered in a workshop. What mattered was not certainty, but implication. If radio energy could interfere with aircraft systems under specific conditions, then those conditions might be encouraged during combat. The suspicion was enough to justify a deliberate next step. Keep watching to see how commanders cautiously tried to trigger this effect during real operations, despite having no proof it would work at all. With no clear theory and no guarantee of results, any attempt to use the phenomenon was approached with restraint. Commanders were unwilling to stake missions on something that behaved more like an accident than a tool. Still, the possibility was too intriguing to ignore entirely. Engineers were allowed to experiment, not to create a new weapon, but to see whether the conditions that seemed to trigger the effect could be encouraged at critical moments. Transmission schedules were adjusted. Power output was briefly increased during known approach windows. Certain frequencies were favored, not because they were proven to work, but because they had appeared repeatedly in earlier incidents. The goal was modest. No one expected engines to fail outright. Even a few seconds of hesitation could be enough to disrupt timing, scatter formations, or force pilots to break off an attack. Results were mixed at best. In a handful of cases, incoming aircraft reported overwhelming radio interference, erratic gauges, and momentary power loss. Attacks were delayed or abandoned, often without the pilots fully understanding why. In other cases, nothing happened at all. Aircraft passed through unaffected, engines running smoothly despite the same transmissions that had unsettled others days earlier. The inconsistency made the phenomenon impossible to formalize. Weather altered results. Aircraft types mattered. Maintenance standards mattered even more. The effect could not be switched on or off at will. It could only be nudged, hoped for, and then watched with uncertainty. What emerged was not a weapon system, but a marginal influence, something that might tip the balance on a bad day, but never replace guns, fighters, or flak. The results were undeniable, but never decisive. In the weeks that followed the limited trials, reports continued to surface of disrupted attacks and aborted runs, often accompanied by the same overwhelming radio interference. Pilots complained of shrieking headsets, erratic instruments, and engines that briefly lost their smooth rhythm before recovering. Yet just as many missions passed through unaffected, the phenomenon refused to behave like a weapon. It could not be aimed, timed, or trusted. As word spread, enemy forces adjusted. Frequencies were changed, procedures were revised, maintenance standards improved, aircraft wiring was inspected, and, where possible, better shielded. The unexplained became explainable enough to ignore. What had once unsettled crews began to fade into the background noise of a technologically chaotic war. No official countermeasure was ever announced, because no official weapon had ever been acknowledged. Internally, the idea lost momentum. Commanders saw no path to standardization. Engineers could not guarantee results. Without reliability, there could be no doctrine, and without doctrine, no future. The radio whistle remained an anomaly, interesting, unsettling, but ultimately impractical. It lingered in reports and memories, never advancing beyond the margins of operational planning. Before the topic quietly disappeared, it left behind one lasting lesson. The electromagnetic environment mattered more than anyone had realized. Machines were not as isolated as engineers once believed, and war had begun to spill into invisible domains that defied intuition. Keep watching to see how this almost worked weapon was later reinterpreted, not as a failure, but as an early warning of a new kind of battlefield. And if you want more untold stories of forgotten experiments and near-miss weapons, like and subscribe to Warfield Secrets. In hindsight, the radio whistle was never a weapon in the traditional sense. It caused no crashes, destroyed no aircraft, and could not be relied upon to stop an attack. Yet dismissing it as a failure misses its deeper significance. What emerged during those brief, confusing encounters was an early glimpse of how modern warfare would evolve beyond visible force. The effect revealed that machines operating in complex environments could be influenced in unexpected ways, not by direct damage, but by interference. The engineers who investigated the phenomenon were limited by the tools and understanding of their time. Electromagnetic theory existed, but the practical behavior of energy interacting with mobile, electrically complex systems was still poorly understood. Without consistent results, the idea could not survive the demands of wartime decision-making. Reliability mattered more than curiosity, and uncertainty had no place in formal doctrine. Yet the implications did not disappear. In later decades, military planners would deliberately explore the electromagnetic spectrum as a battlefield of its own. Jamming, spoofing, and electronic attack would become precise, intentional, and central to air warfare. What had once been an accidental disturbance would evolve into a core strategic domain. The radio whistle remains a reminder of how progress often begins at the edges of failure. War does not always reveal its future through success. Sometimes it does so through moments that almost worked, briefly unsettling assumptions before slipping back into obscurity. In that narrow space between accident and intention, the foundations of modern electronic warfare quietly took shape.